Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's one of the big ones. We're going to be talking about the new album from Nickelback, titled No Fixed Address. Now, I know a lot of people who really hate Nickelback. And here's the thing. Most of you guys, you don't get it if you don't live up here in Canada. For as much as Nickelback ruled rock radio across the Bush administration, they were much more omnipresent up here in Canada, where regulations from the government required that the radio play a certain amount of Canadian content. And sure, for that we get Metric, Marianas Trench, Serena Ryder, and a slew of other great Canadian acts you guys will never have heard of, but it also means that of the many singles that Nickelback puts out, they all get airplay up here. It's probably from that broader point of view and perspective that I can say this with a fair amount of certainty. Trust a guy who knows. There are a lot worse bands than Nickelback. They got hit with the worst band ever labeled, not because they were legitimately that much more terrible than some of their peers. I mean, when you've got 3 Days Grace, Creed, Seether, Hinder, and Theory of a Deadman behind you who have made a lot worse music, Nickelback started looking pretty benign and mediocre. But let's be fair here, they were everywhere in the 2000s, and that made their mediocrity a lot easier to hate simply because there was that much more of it. Now granted, Nickelback have written some genuinely terrible songs, especially when they were trying to go for any sort of pretensions towards depth. But you know what? There's a place for a few of them when they cater to the absolute lowest common denominator of hard rock debauchery and sleaze. And to be fair, it was much better fit for Chad Kroeger's voice than the insufferable bitching of songs like This Is How You Remind Me, or Someday, or Saving Me, or the pretentious platitudes of Gonna Be Somebody, or If Today Was Your Last Day, and especially If Everyone Cared. To me, Nickelback worked the best on grimy tracks about fighting, drinking, screwing, and behaving like swaggering rock star assholes. Completely awash in bad taste and shallow subject matter, almost analogous to Katy Perry's formula when you talk at pop music. Now, some of you are inevitably thinking, wait a minute, you rip on bro country all the time when it gets sleazy and ignorant and much of the same formula. Are you seriously giving Nickelback a pass here? And let me make this clear, I'm not doing that. Catering to the lowest common denominator will only get you so far. But you know what? Nickelback can get away with more than most for me, mostly thanks to Chad Kroeger having a lot of presence behind the microphone, the band developing more of a heavy rock edge, and some genuinely solid songs like This Afternoon and Burn It to the Ground. But I'll be fair here, there's a huge track of the discography that pushes the sleaze into really uncomfortable territory, and it's rarely enough fun to back it up. But most of the hatred they get isn't for that reason. No. It's not about hating Nickelback, but hating the fans of Nickelback for supposedly giving them a free pass. Something that rings as a little bit hypocritical from some critics who have praised similar brands of vulgarity when it comes from, say, hip-hop, or metal, or R&B. Say what you will about Nickelback's Dark Horse, for as gross as most of that album is, and it is kind of disgusting, let's be fair here, at least it's honest. At least it knows exactly what it is. Now that being said, with Nickelback's commercial decline in the 2010s, they have aimed to diversify their sound a fair bit. Recruiting Joey Moy to produce their 2011 album Here and Now proved surprisingly effective in adding some real punch and meat to their usual formula. Although that album did feel bogged down in unnecessary and really quite embarrassing ballads. In other words, I had no idea how good or bad their newest album No Fixed Address would turn out to be. So, okay, what did we get here? Ooh boy, I was not expecting this. Where the Foo Fighters promised a grander thematic focus with Sonic Highways and instead delivered another album that sounded distinctly like the Foo Fighters, Nickelback's attempts at experimentation on No Fixed Address have led to a record that flies completely off the rails. I don't think I've heard an album that sound this fragmented, confused, and desperate all year. The scattershot scrambling for some sort of unique sound and identity that crosses half a dozen different genres and doesn't bring together the slightest element of cohesion. And yet, can I say there are some passable songs on this album? Some tracks I can enjoy? Well, a few, but for as much as this record flails around and tries so hard, it doesn't exactly land a lot of hits, and that's kind of disappointing. So okay, let's start with our frontman, Chad Kroeger. One of the most divisive points with regards to Nickelback as a whole. You either like or you hate his voice, and for me, I can tolerate it more than most, but you can tell it's taken a real beating over the past few years. Reminds me a lot of the same strain that's happened to Garth Brooks' voice on his comeback album, Man Against Machine, with the lower, thicker range that you usually use to add visceral grit and some texture to those howls. It feels really worn away. Here, Chad Kroeger struck more in his mid-range, which even with multi-tracking sounds a fair bit thinner and less potent. It doesn't help matters that with obvious layers of pitch correction and auto-tune and vocal effects, that vocal punch is diluted even further, and believe me, that's the last thing Nickelback needs. Granted, the production is all over the place, all over this record, which takes us to the instrumentation, which, to be blunt, is a complete mess. I can't tell you how badly Mutt Lange and Joey Moyer missed here behind the soundboard, because at least they brought some consistent snarl and color to the guitars, because the opening tracks, they go for this flat, down-tuned slurry that barely has any snarl or heft behind it, with terminally underweight bass lines and a wet-sounding vocal filter that I get the uneasy feeling the band thought was psychedelic on Million Miles an Hour. It's followed by What Are You Waiting For that tries to go for synth and drum machine-driven modern rock with some acoustic texture, but it just curdles into this thin, underwhelming mess. And that's before we get to the sleazy, borderline funk grime of She Keeps Me Up, the Poets of the Fall-esque vocal leads punching up on the noisy drums and terminally underweight groove of Make Me Believe Again, the chugging groove heavy borderline country rock of Give 'Em Up and Sister Sin, the latter that tries to blend lo-fi vocals, heavy strumming and percussion, and gang vocals into a song that really should kick a lot more ass than it does. And then there's the arena rock styling of The Hammers Coming Down that almost reminds me a little bit of uptuned Linkin Park with the piano intro with some more grandiose ambitions to go along with it. Granted, I'll take those songs over the tepid mid-tempo vibe of Satellite, or the twinkling chimes and steel drums on the overmixed Miss You, or the popping beat, the horn section, and the out-of-nowhere flow ride guest verse on Got Me Running Round. Look, here's what bothers me about all this. There are some moments of texture and presence on this album that I actually kind of liked. I didn't mind the more groove-heavy country rock style and the piano lead into The Hammers Coming Down. That was solid, and the rollicking pseudo-funk of She Keeps Me Up almost reminds me a little bit of the trashier side of a band like Wild Cherry from the 70s, and that was fun. But the big problem with all this experimentation is that all the ventures into different genres, it feels painfully calculated and nowhere near as potent as it should. Nickelback wants to get political for a minute on Edge of a Revolution, but they never invest enough in the heaviness and the grit and the quicker tempo you need to reach that hardcore punk vibe they were trying to get. They strike towards alternative metal and country rock, but the guitar textures and the percussion always feel a little bit too clean and lightweight to really grip me here, not getting the grime or the intensity of their influences and never really willing to compromise that radio airplay. And the inclusion of obvious drum machines and synths make it obvious how little cohesion and investment Nickelback has in some of these experiments beyond just desperate grabs for whatever's popular on rock radio right now. And now we have to come to the lyrics. And okay, really, lyrics for Nickelback, they fall into two categories. Your earnest, pseudo-inspirational, and really not all that interesting songs, and your sleazy and tasteless stuff, the latter of which they do a fair bit better. Now, a good half of this album falls into the first category, complete with bafflingly weak love songs like Satellite, the sloppily written and bizarrely chipper song Miss You, and the really weird vibe of Got Me Running Round, half pure leering sleaze and half trying to ground it all in meeting the girl's parents and buying her jewelry, and yet it's played so broad, especially with the flow ride guest verse, that I don't know if it's considered as a joke or not. The pseudo-comedy vibe comes up again on Get 'Em Up, where the narrator and his boys sketch out a plan to rob a bank in just a lot of the same language of a dance song, only to realize that the bank was closed because it's Sunday and now they're getting busted by the cops. Maybe it's just me, but perhaps it was a really bad decision to pick one of the heaviest instrumentals on this entire album and pair it with decidedly goofy lyrics that definitely don't make Nickelback look awesome. It's part of the same noxious self-awareness that Nickelback has that sours me on their big hit Rockstar from a couple albums ago. A song that tried to satirize rockstar hedonism and being that kind of badass. Yet in reality, those are the songs where Nickelback sounds the best, or at least the most convincing. The whiskey-stained Sister Sin, the acid freakout of Million Miles an Hour, and especially the twitchy, very obvious cocaine references of She Keeps Me Up, they're a much stronger fit lyrically for Nickelback. Hell, all the double entendres in She Keeps Me Up almost seemed a little bit too subtle for the band, until I realized that it was co-written by Marianas Trench frontman Josh Ramsey, and makes all sorts of sense then. He also wrote Satellite, which makes sense why it's a little bit too sentimental for Nickelback to pull off convincingly, so no surprises there either. And you know what, for as more of Nickelback's more broad material, their more anthemic stuff, only The Hammers Coming Down really landed for me, mostly thanks to the darker, more apocalyptic vibe, which unsurprisingly Nickelback could pull off pretty well. Wish they did more of it. Look, at the end of the day, It's a Nickelback record. They've long ago stopped giving a damn like critics like me have to think or say, which honestly begs the question why I'm reviewing it. This is an album stretched thin, flailing desperately to find a mainstream accessible lane since post-grunge isn't as viable anymore, and yet not committed enough to make any of that experimentation really stick. Pair that with sloppy production, and you get an album that's less of a curiosity to examine than a frustrating case study of a band that has become somewhat lost years after their commercial peak. In other words, it's a lot like 50 Cent's most recent comeback album earlier this year, Animal Ambition. And No Fixed Address by Nickelback is getting the exact same rating that album did, a 5 out of 10, and only a recommendation to hardcore Nickelback fans and anybody curious to see where they're going these days. After all, the album is called No Fixed Address. It's rare that titles are so apt and unintentionally revealing. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. This review took a lot of takes. Sorry if I come across as really tired in this review. It was a pain in the ass to film. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming up that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.